Look at almost any American store, church, apartment building, or strip mall from above, and you'll see the same shape. Building in the middle, asphalt moat around it. It feels normal, almost invisible, just the price of modern life. But a lot of those empty spaces were never built because customers demanded them. They were built because rules demanded them. And most people who have lived their entire lives in America have never heard of those rules. This is not really a story about parking. It's a story about how a bureaucratic habit, copied, repeated, and quietly hardened into law, helped redesign the country by accident. Think about the last time you pulled into a big box store on a Tuesday afternoon. Half the lot was empty, maybe more. You parked, walked across what felt like a small runway, went inside, bought your thing, walked back across the asphalt, got in your car, and left. And that felt normal, because it always looks like that. Now think about a church you've driven past. Enormous parking lot. Empty every day except Sunday morning. And even then, a good chunk of it sits unused. Same with office parks, which have started to feel almost archaeological. Rows of spaces baking in the sun, built for a workday that increasingly doesn't exist. Or think about the strip mall where you grab lunch. The parking area out front is often larger than the stores themselves. You could fit another building in that space, maybe two. At some point, if you stare at enough of these places, a question starts to form. Did all of this just happen? Did the market produce this many spaces because drivers actually needed them? Or is something else going on? The obvious answer is Americans drive. Of course there's parking everywhere. Of course it's big. This is just what happens when you build a car-dependent country. And that answer is mostly right. But it is not complete because a very large share of those spaces, that asphalt, that land, that money, was not just a market response to demand. It was a legal requirement, a mandate, a line in a local zoning code that said, if you want to build here, you must provide this many parking spaces. And here is where the story gets strange. The rule is called a minimum parking requirement. Every city that has one tells builders and developers exactly how many off-street parking spaces they must include for each type of building, not how many they might want to provide, but how many they are legally required to provide. So a city might say, a restaurant must provide one space for every 100 square feet of floor area. An apartment building must provide 1.5 spaces per unit. A church must provide one space for every 4 seats. A shopping center must provide 4 or 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet. These numbers are written into local zoning codes. They are enforced. And if you do not meet them, you do not get a building permit. That sounds like it could be reasonable. Someone must have figured out the right numbers, done the research, calibrated it carefully to actual local conditions, right? We'll get to that. For now, let's start with where the rule came from, because it is older than most people would guess. The first American city to require off-street parking for apartment buildings was Columbus, Ohio. The year was 1923. That is over 100 years ago. Cars were still a novelty in much of the country, and Columbus was already writing parking mandates into its zoning code. Fresno, California went further. In 1939, Fresno became the first American city to extend off-street parking requirements beyond housing to hotels, hospitals, and other commercial uses. Over the following decades, cities across the country looked at what their neighbors were doing, decided it seemed reasonable, and wrote their own versions. The practice spread not because of any grand national planning initiative, not because Congress mandated it, not because a federal agency studied it carefully and issued guidelines. It spread because cities copied each other, and that is where the story begins to get genuinely strange. By the 1970s, urban planners were already aware that this was how it worked. A 1971 report from the Planning Advisory Service, the research arm of the American Planning Association, acknowledged that when cities try to figure out parking requirements, one of the most common approaches is simply checking what nearby cities require. The report noted with considerable understatement that this approach risks producing a repetition of someone else's mistakes. That line was written in 1971. Decades passed. The copying continued. So if cities were copying each other, who had the original numbers? Where did the first figures come from? How did anyone decide how much parking a restaurant or an office building or a church actually needs? There was a second method, a technical manual, something that looked like science. The Institute of Transportation Engineers, a professional organization, produced a document called the Parking Generation Manual. It tried to answer the same question empirically: how much parking does a given land use actually generate? The idea was to survey real sites, count how many cars showed up at peak times, and produce data that planners could actually use. That sounds much better. Survey real places, count actual cars, report the numbers. But here's the problem. The sites that were surveyed were not random. They were overwhelmingly suburban. They were places with lots of free parking already available, and they had little or no transit access. In other words, the surveys were measuring how many cars showed up at places where driving was essentially the only option and where parking was already free and abundant. Donald Shoup, a UCLA planning professor who spent decades studying this system, examined the ITE parking generation data carefully. What he found was remarkable. Half of the reported parking generation rates, the numbers that planners across the country were treating as technical benchmarks, were based on 4 or fewer surveys, 4 or fewer, and more than 1 in 5 of those rates was based on a single survey. One survey, one parking lot, counted once, at one location, on one day. And that number became a planning standard. It was cited in local codes. It was used to require parking minimums in cities that had never commissioned their own study. It was treated as authoritative. Shoup found another piece of data that made this even more striking. In the 1990 nationwide personal transportation survey, 99% of reported car trips involved no paid parking. 9 out of every 10 car trips already had free parking at the destination, which means the demand being measured, the parking generation rates in those manuals, was measuring how many cars showed up at places where parking was already free and required no trade-off whatsoever. It was like measuring how much food people eat at an all-you-can-eat buffet and calling it the natural human appetite. And then using that number to decide how much food every restaurant in the country must keep on hand. Shoup had a phrase for this feedback loop. He called free parking the tail that wags two dogs, because the assumption of free parking shaped both how Americans traveled and how American land was used. The supply of free spaces made driving the obvious choice, which generated demand for more spaces, which justified more requirements, which produced more spaces. The system fed itself. Now here's the part that turns the whole thing into something almost comedic if it weren't so expensive. What kinds of places did cities write specific parking minimums for? Not just restaurants and offices and apartments. Cities had specific coded parking requirements for places like junkyards, for bingo parlors, for kennels, for rifle ranges, for pet cemeteries. One planning review found that some cities had minimum parking requirements for 179 distinct land uses, 179, each one with its own formula. Each formula arrived at through some combination of copying neighboring cities and consulting studies built from suburban drive-in sites counted once or twice. This was not a national conspiracy. It was something more peculiar and in some ways more American, a local rule, copied so many times and for so long that it began to look like common sense. It acquired the texture of expertise. It had numbers. It had manuals. It had historical precedent. It just didn't have particularly good evidence behind it. Now we need to talk about what this actually cost, because this is where the story stops being about bureaucratic quirk and starts being about real money, real land, and real consequences for real people. Start with land. A UCLA analysis looking at shopping centers in 17 American cities found that on average, cities required 3 1/3 parking spaces for every 1,000 square feet of retail floor area. If you factor in the space each stall actually takes, the stall itself plus the access lanes, that required parking area often exceeds the size of the building it serves. The parking lot is bigger than the store, required by law. Now move to money. A 2026 study from UCLA and the Bureau of Transportation Statistics looked at the cost of building structured parking, the kind required in denser areas, in 7 American cities. The numbers are not what most people would guess. The average construction cost for an underground parking space in 2025, $73,000 per space. For an above-ground structured space, $52,000. In Portland, underground parking reached roughly $111,000 per space. Per space, not per lot, per individual parking spot. Now take a typical 1,000 square foot office building in Las Vegas. The building itself, at current construction costs, runs about $232,000. Add the parking required by local zoning, and you're pushing the total project cost to roughly $400,000 underground or $337,000 above ground. Across the full 7-city office sample in that study, required parking increased office construction costs by an average of 68% with underground parking, 47% with above ground. That is not a rounding error. That is nearly doubling the cost of building an office because of a formula in a zoning code. Housing is where it gets closest to home for most people. The same study found that required parking increased the cost of building a studio apartment by an average of 39% when underground parking was required and 26% with above ground. For a 2-bedroom apartment, the increases were 20% and 14%. And these costs don't disappear, they get passed on. The developer builds in the parking cost, the rent goes up, the buyer pays a higher price, the business passes it on in prices. The municipality loses taxable density that could have existed on land that is now asphalt. Victoria Transport Policy Institute, one of the main research bodies on transportation economics, estimates that a typical North American community has somewhere between 3 and 6 parking spaces for every vehicle, 3 to 6 spaces per car. And the estimated annual cost of all of that parking, land, construction, maintenance, runs to about $1,200 per space per year. That's roughly $5,000 per vehicle per year. Across the entire country, the annual cost of parking comes to more than $1 trillion. $1 trillion a year, with most of that cost buried in rents, prices, and taxes rather than paid directly by the drivers using the spaces. The Victoria Transport Policy Institute estimates that drivers directly pay only about a quarter of total parking costs. Everyone else absorbs the rest, whether they drive or not. The U.S. Department of Transportation put the space estimate higher, somewhere between 3 and 8 parking spaces per car nationwide. And it noted bluntly that required parking areas routinely exceed the footprint of the buildings they serve, and that this kind of development pattern works directly against walkable communities. This is the hidden ledger. The costs are real. They just don't appear in any obvious place. They are folded into your rent, your retail prices, your property taxes, the gap between what a neighborhood could have been and what it became. Now here's where the story shifts. At some point in the last decade or so, some cities started asking a simple question: what actually happens if we stop requiring all this parking? The fears were easy to articulate. Streets would fill with overflow cars. Neighborhoods would become impossible to navigate. Customers wouldn't come. Businesses would suffer. Congestion would worsen. Those fears are real in the sense that they are sincerely held, and they are politically potent. Research by Richard Wilson found that when planners and officials decide how to set parking requirements, the most common pressures pushing them toward higher numbers are exactly these fears: spillover parking, traffic, complaints from neighbors and businesses. Risk avoidance, more than technical precision, often drives the formula. But then some cities actually ran the experiment. Buffalo, New York was first. In 2017, Buffalo adopted what it called the Green Code, a comprehensive overhaul of its zoning rules. As part of that overhaul, Buffalo became the first American city to eliminate minimum off-street parking requirements citywide. Not reduce them, eliminate them. For the whole city, what happened? Researchers tracked major projects built under the new code, 36. Major developments built 47% fewer parking spaces than the old code would have required. 14 mixed-use developments built 53% fewer spaces, not 0 spaces, fewer than the mandate demanded. Developers were still building parking, just as much as they actually thought their tenants and customers would need, rather than as many as a formula told them they had to. A later study looked at the housing built in Buffalo after 2017. It found that nearly 70% of the housing units constructed after the repeal would have been illegal under the old parking rules. 7 out of every 10 new homes, illegal, not because they were built badly, but because they didn't include enough parking to satisfy a zoning code whose numbers were, to be generous about it, imprecise. Daniel Hess, the Buffalo planning researcher who studied the repeal, put it plainly. Minimum parking requirements, he said, have done immense harm. We have so much asphalt. Minneapolis followed a few years later. In 2015, Minneapolis had already begun cutting parking requirements for multifamily housing near high-frequency transit. Research by the Metropolitan Council found that projects built under those reduced requirements had a median of 0.82 parking spaces per unit. Projects in smaller buildings, 10 to 50 units, came in at 0.42. The sky did not fall. Developers built what the market needed. By May 2021, Minneapolis eliminated minimum parking requirements citywide. Then the scale-up began in earnest. California passed Assembly Bill 1997, which took effect January 1, 2023. It bars most parking minimums within a half mile of a major transit stop. That covers a very large share of developable land in California's biggest cities. Oregon went further in 2023, pushing parking reforms across 48 metro area cities, eliminating mandates in many transit-rich areas, and encouraging outright repeal. Portland eliminated minimum parking requirements citywide by June 30, 2023. And then Austin. On November 2, 2023, Austin's City Council voted 8-2 to eliminate minimum parking requirements citywide. Austin, one of the largest and most car-dependent cities in America, voted to end the mandate. The argument was not ideological, it was practical. Councilmember Zoe Kadri said it plainly. The mandates gobble up scarce land. They raise costs, they hurt small businesses, they work against transit and pedestrian infrastructure. Other advocates were just as direct. Tony Jordan, a parking reform advocate, said it had become hard for reasonable people to really defend those mandates anymore. UCLA's Institute of Transportation Studies, surveying the landscape in late 2025, reported that more than 100 American cities had now eliminated minimum parking requirements citywide. Hundreds more had adopted partial reforms. This went from a fringe academic critique to mainstream urban policy in less than a decade. Let's take a moment and step back. The system that shaped American parking lots was not inevitable. It was not the natural result of a car-loving culture making free choices. A significant portion of it was legally mandated, required by zoning codes that spread across the country through imitation, enforced with numbers drawn from limited data, and defended by planners whose primary motivation was often avoiding complaints rather than optimizing land use. The result was real. Land that could have held storefronts or apartments or narrower streets was required to become asphalt. Housing costs went up. Construction costs went up. Rents went up. Walkable, human-scale development became harder to build legally because fitting enough parking was nearly impossible on a small lot. Renters who paid those costs never signed up for them. Renters who never asked for a parking space paid for one anyway, bundled into their monthly rent. Small business owners who wanted a compact, affordable footprint were forced to either acquire more land or give up on the project. Non-drivers subsidized an infrastructure they never used through higher retail prices and taxes, and almost no one knew there was a rule behind any of it. Now here is what reform doesn't mean, because this matters. Eliminating minimum parking requirements does not mean eliminating parking. It does not mean declaring war on drivers. Oregon's own review of its parking reforms makes this clear. Experience shows that developers and lenders still build parking when there is demand for it. If a project is located somewhere people need cars, parking gets built. The difference is that the amount is calibrated to actual need, not to a formula derived from a suburban drive-through lot surveyed once in the 1980s. The goal is not zero parking. The goal is replacing a bureaucratic mandate with market reality. And this is where the story opens up into something larger. The parking lot you have driven through your whole life, the half-empty expanse, the asphalt moat around the big box store, the giant church lot quiet on a Wednesday, the strip mall where you walk past more concrete than storefront, that landscape was not fate. It was a choice. Or more precisely, it was the accumulated result of thousands of local choices, each one copying the one before it, each one backed by numbers that often rested on surprisingly thin evidence. Where did minimum parking requirements come from? Donald Shoup asked that question decades ago. His answer was essentially, no one knows. The rules accumulated, they hardened, they became normal. And the most important sentence in this entire story may be the simplest one. Normal is not the same as inevitable. More than 100 American cities have now looked at the thing everyone assumed was just how things worked and decided to try something different. The early evidence from places like Buffalo and Minneapolis is that the fears were overstated. Developers make reasonable choices when the mandate is lifted. The lots got smaller, the buildings got built, the cities did not collapse. America was redesigned by a bureaucratic habit. A rule that spread not through conspiracy but through imitation, through risk-averse local officials who needed a number and reached for the nearest one, through planning manuals built on thin data and suburban assumptions, through decades of parking minimums for pet cemeteries, rifle ranges, and bingo parlors, written into law, enforced quietly, and paid for by everyone whether they knew it or not. The next time you pull into a half-empty lot, take one extra second to notice the size of it. Notice what isn't there, the building that didn't get built, the apartment that was never affordable, the block that never came together. That space has a price. It always did. It just wasn't on any sign.